How do we nurture our spiritual paths? We nurture our spiritual paths through a lifelong process of having experiences and striving to understand them and make use of them. We do so by trial and error through learning things, first from our parents, family, friends, and neighbors, and then through the things we hear, see, read, and find out as we become educated, grow up, and become worldly. Daily, we use both our growing empirical, rational, scientific understanding to analyze our experiences and develop our rational concepts. And we use our growing intuitive, imaginative, mystical insights to guide our insights and actions. Even the most hard-nosed scientist or technical person didn't fall in love using their rational analytical processes alone. And even the most intuitive, mystical kind of person uses the rational mind too. Every day, a lot, both of them. 21st century humanity has increasingly shared perspective because contemporary global conditions compel us to develop a common reality that allows us to communicate and cooperate by sharing scholarship, collaborating in scientific discoveries, using technologies, enjoying our creations, playing, singing, dancing, and listening to music, and healing our wounds. Intuitively, most human beings realize that each of us has some of the truth and that no one has all of the truth. And it is increasingly apparent to a majority of human beings that we can all learn useful things from almost any other person. I got a lot of lessons about human differences from the garbage collector that came on a wagon with a horse that I fell in love with as a little boy. And my mom and dad would let me ride with this immigrant to the dump. And most of the good small town Kansas middle class folks thought that was a little scandalous. And then as I grew up, I would go down to my grandfather's Georgia farm, and the caretaker on the farm was I thought, ancient black lady. Maybe she was in her 50s, early 60s. And she had a gun that my grandfather had replaced with a new one, and for himself and a group of hunting dogs. And I'd go over and she'd shoot a squirrel, the dogs would go out and get it, and come bring it back, and she'd fry it up, and we'd have squirrel for breakfast. And then I'd go and have, second breakfast for Grandma and Grandpa. And I learned more from her than almost any one person in the course of my childhood about being a human being. Neither of them had formal education. Neither of them were among the elite of the world. So, if we're lucky, we have a lot of guides in the course of our lives. So this shared perspective is far from universal, but it is universal, global, and it includes a significant and quickly growing proportion of our world's population. Almost certainly far more than 1 billion of the 7+ billion people alive today. And a great many of them are here in the United States, and a lot of those people are immigrants from other countries and other religions. The religious landscape is dramatically different than it was when most of us were born. Did you realize that fewer than half, 47% of Americans now belong to any religious congregation? It was 70% in 1999. Half of Americans have changed their religion in the course of their lives, and 25% of marriages are interfaith unions, as my first marriage was, and both my children's marriages are. In California, 27% of California residents are foreign-born. Half of California's children have a foreign-born parent, as my children do. The United States is now the most religiously diverse nation on earth. California is the most diverse state, and the Greater Bay Area is one of the most spiritually diverse regions in the country. If we Unitarian Universalists are indeed seeking greater diversity and more membership, reaching out to people that grew up in and from other religious backgrounds, traditions, and cultures is an obvious and a necessary path. So if you want to be an evangelical Unitarian, talk to your foreign-born dentist or doctor or CEO or colleague at work or neighbor. My Indian wife was a Jain and Hindu mix from her own parentage. She became a Unitarian, but she was still a Hindu and a Jain. A lot of us that grew up in Christian backgrounds or Jewish backgrounds have adopted Buddhist practices or other practices from other religions. We have whole groups of Buddhist Unitarians and pagan Unitarians and Jewish Unitarians and Christian Unitarians. Americans are not alone in this exploding diversity. Billions of people throughout the globe are well educated by contemporary standards and, like most of us, combine flourishing ancestral roots with an increasingly shared global outlook. How could the world work now if we did not share this global outlook? Millions of those in every faith also embrace a contemporary outlook. Many still base part of their beliefs, as many of us do, in practices on ancestral religious traditions. But millions of those in every faith also embrace contemporary understandings of reality and are accepting and tolerant of people very dissimilar from themselves. Many are our physicians and dentists, accountants and neighbors. Some of them also wonder if they are religious anymore. But they too are living spiritual lives of integrity, conscience, and principle like us, striving, as we do, to transcend selfishness and greed, at least sometimes, have their own mystical experiences and intuitive wisdoms, as well as their globally pervasive rational systems. The world is spiritually diverse. Of the 7 billion plus human beings, in excess of 2 million are Christians. 1.2 billion of them are Roman Catholics, but the growth of Christianity is in the global south, not in the global north. 1.5 billion are Muslim, and 80% of them Sunni Muslims. 1 billion in the world are non-religious by traditional standards, with most in China and other communist countries, but there are also many in the United States and other Western nations, including, I'm sure, this congregation. 1 billion are Hindus, most in India, but more than 3 million Americans have ancestry from India. And you may or may not know, but they are actually the wealthiest ethnic group in America, among the best educated. 500 million are primarily practitioners of an indigenous ethnic faith. 400 million of those are Chinese. About 400 million on earth are Buddhist, and more than 1% of Americans are Buddhists, if not in ancestry and regular spiritual practices like me. 23 million are Sikhs, and half of the 500,000 Sikhs in America are just up the road to our northeast, particularly around Yuba City. 14 million are Jews, and more than half of all the Jews in the world are U.S. citizens. 4 million are Jains, and there are a melange of newer syncretistic faiths like the Unitarian Universalism. The mother of my children, now deceased, was herself the product of a mixed marriage with a Hindu father and a Jain mother. The two families have been very good friends. The Jain family was actually better off. But when the oldest son of the Hindu family married this Jain woman that they knew very well and loved, the Hindu patriarch would not allow the family to attend the wedding. Yet Madhavi's father and mother, in the years afterwards, paid for all of his brothers and sisters to attend college, because he'd gone to MIT after undergraduate in India and gotten a PhD in engineering in 2.5 years, a record. There's a plaque on the wall in MIT. And then he couldn't get a job in India because they weren't hiring American PhDs. And so he went to Britain and worked for a private company and had a couple of patents and did very well, and went into a spectacular career in India before his premature death. So my wife grew up in this mixed marriage, and she remained both a Hindu and a Jain, as well as becoming a Unitarian Universalist. And my home now is full of Hindu gods and goddesses, and I find the Hindu view of God as the Brahman, a combination of the universal's thrust of energy, evolution, and creativity, and that same element within ourselves, the Atman, to be the most useful divine image that I found. My spiritual practices are significantly Buddhist, seeking to live with mindfulness, effective compassion, and an engaged but nonviolent struggle for justice. My philosophical stance is significantly Jain, for the Jains for several thousand years have taught that truth inevitably remains relative and transitory, is inevitably more or less probable, and that every aspect of reality continues to evolve. Gee, those all sound pretty sensible, don't they, to a lot of Unitarian Universalists? And the Jains had those ideas for several thousand years. Taoism is Chinese mysticism, and Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching is the most preeminent text for spiritual naturalism. I'm a philosophical naturalist and have repeated Lao Tzu's admonition daily for more than half a century as a central guide of my life. Creative endeavor without possession, action without aggression, and development without domination. Confucianism is Chinese humanism. Confucians' insight about social relationships, like our hymn, provide useful insights about social relationships. Too often, Western humanists don't surmount their own tendencies toward anarchistic libertarianism and materialistic egotism. Taoism and Confucianism are useful tools to help Western humanists and naturalists become both more ecologically sensitive and more socially and organizationally effective. Japanese spirituality represents an ancient history of syncretism, of mixing religions. They adopted much from Chinese practices, from Buddhist thought and spirituality, and combining them with their indigenous Shintoism, which sees the kami or divine in almost everything. And I had the great privilege to have a good friend, Yoshi Matsuda, with me in the first year of seminary. He is a Shinto, part of a subsect called Konkokyo that was created by a farmer in late 19th, early 20th century Japan that said, no, the kami is in each of us. Sounds like universalism, doesn't it? And then I got to go at the tag end of my year in India studying Gandhianism when I was in seminary to Japan, and Yoshi took me all around, and I talked with 100 different Konkokyo mediators, their ministers, about the kind of counseling they do, which combines very traditional Shinto practices and very modern therapeutic practices. So, for instance, there were 3 different cases where the presenting cause with the different people in different congregations was alcoholism. The one case, the mediator gave the gentleman a rice crate blessing and send him on his way. The second one was rather much a counseling session, as we would see it in a Western sense. And the third one, I think the man had come with this presenting problem again and again to the mediator. And the mediator was an older man, like I am now, and they kneel, which would kill me to do now. But, and he reached over and he grabbed this man about his own size and picked him off the floor and basically said, "Get your act together." And I bet all three methods worked, okay? I mean, as those of you who know about therapy know, different strokes for different folks, you know, it doesn't work. It doesn't even work for the same person at different times in their life. I had 4 different therapists in the course of my life so far, and all 4 have been useful, and they've all been very different. I cherish the Japanese concept of ame, A-M-A-E, which represents their concept of mature, loving dependence upon others. I think too often in our culture we think the goal is independence. Independence, independence, independence. And then most of us at some point, or a lot of points, end up lonely as hell. And so we need other people. On the whole, I think women have been taught more about that and do that better than men. But unfortunately, our culture is kind of going the other way, so with women trying to do what they need to do in our context and deserve to do, you know. I mean, it's hard to get independent and do it for yourself and still be dependent on others in a mature way. And we all need to learn to do that, I think, before we really need it and don't have any practice. I cherish and wish to live Judaism's intent to help to heal a broken world. The Hebrew term tikkun olam implies that each of us has responsibilities not only to ourselves and our intimates, but need to help to heal, repair, and improve the world. My Judaism is the Judaism of Baruch Spinoza, believing that people can be happy by learning to live rational lives, but need to make their reasoning, their appetites, and environments compatible, because the habits of virtue take a lifetime of experimental learning. My Judaism is the Judaism of Martin Buber, with his divine in the between, his God as a verb, and the thou of ourselves and other people like Socrates, the thou with the natural world like Goethe, and the thou of our spirit's potential like Jesus. My Judaism is a God worth arguing with. And like Buber, I try not to fall into the worship of Israel as a solely Jewish ethnic nation, or any nation as sacrosanct. I'm viscerally opposed to any kind of national idolatry. I am not a Christian, but I try to be a Jesusian. I think I invented the word. Following his ethical messages and intents, but remembering that what he was really teaching is that all people are children of God, and that the kind of relationship that he tried to practice is something that we all can aspire to practice. Like the practitioners of Islam, I bow with my face on the floor at the beginning of my morning devotions. Now, sometimes I need to pry myself up with a piece of furniture, but I still do it. And why do I do it? Well, not to worship Muhammad, but to admit to myself that I am entirely dependent upon this world. The world was here before me. It will be here after me. I'm a very small speck in this earth. And I need to put my face on the floor and admit that every day, because otherwise I get too caught up in myself. To remember that life is a gift and that I am in the hands of creation, and through my days, Islam's long history of allowing those under Islamic sovereignty to practice their own religions is a much brighter history than most of our Middle Eastern Western religions. The admonition to give 2.5% of your wealth each year to those in need outside of your intimate circle is a practice I think could be a model for the world. Their history of supporting the scholarship of other cultures is also superior to many of our Western pretensions. Kathleen and I visited Spain and Portugal lately. They had a long period where they were the center of the Jewish world. They were really the intellectual center for the Islamic world. They were way ahead. They were teaching Europeans about the ancient Greeks because they didn't know about the ancient Greeks. Those Jews and those Muslims were doing that. They were way ahead of us. Well, up to the time of the Renaissance, certainly from a Western perspective. Islam's practice of welcoming the stranger and being kind to the visitor are worthy practices for us all. So my book, that, yes, I have a few copies out for sale, is not an attempt to persuade you to practice spirituality as I do. You have to find your own way. I'll believe as I have come to believe, but to provide a guide to each of the world's historic religions, realizing that religions, like each of us, constantly evolve, learning and changing as we go. If we wish to flourish in the 21st century, we need to become global citizens, embracing other religions and cultures, and not just expecting everyone will become just like us. The other book, I have a couple of copies for sale, is a book with all poetic interpretations of all the 150 Old Testament Psalms. That one took me 6 years, and then the 118th Psalm, if you don't know, is a whole bunch of short, kind of one-stanza psalms with these different abbreviations that the scholars don't really know who they are. So I thought, okay. So I took another year in the midst of my ministry and raising little kids, and put figures from the Old Testament that we would recognize with these. So, they're just my interpretations, but I think you might find them useful. 5 of them got into choral versions, and one of them people have asked me to use in a lot of memorial services. So I think some of them are useful. I thank you very much for having me here. It was a blessing, and I'm sure Kathleen and I will be back here since this is the closest congregation. Probably we're members at San Francisco UU and greatly value that congregation. But it is easy once things are on Zoom to be in your pajamas and watch a service, right? Or eat while the sermons are going on, or if it gets boring, get up and do something else. Oh, it's a great temptation. We have so many temptations in our culture. It's made to keep us sitting and buying. And we need to figure out a way to offset that, I think, on a daily basis. Thank you so much.